Hello, my name is Maureen Buckingham and welcome to my presentation on the digital divide and Indigenous Australians. So this presentation will explore the issue of the digital divide and Indigenous Australians. Its aim is to explore the status of digital access, inclusion and ability for Indigenous Australians and whether the digital divide gap in these areas has closed over the years according to the literature. The presentation will show through data and research that the gap has only narrowed by a small margin over the last decade, and it will explore the reasons why and also the strategies to address this important social issue. So firstly, what is the digital divide? How do we define that? Initially, the digital divide was referred to as the gap between those who did and did not have access to the internet. So it was quite a narrow definition, whereas today many of the research articles now extrapolate the importance of viewing this digital divide as going beyond that notion of just the gap in having access to the internet and ICT, but more so at its core being about social and economic participation among everyone in the community. So we see on the charts on the left, it's very much about looking more about having digital literacy capabilities, and that digital inclusion is based on the premise that everyone should be able to make full use of digital technologies, no matter what sector of the community you come from, where you live, what you earn, and what your education level is. So let's just listen to a very short video introducing this notion of the digital divide. So why is it important for us to address the digital divide? Well, a compelling argument, according to Snyder, is for providing students with ICT access is that new technologies are playing a very crucial role in society, culture and economics, that says that unequal access can have devastating consequences for individuals and communities. And particularly that a key challenge facing Australian education is to enable Indigenous children, particularly from this young age in remote communities, to acquire critical digital literacy capabilities necessary for active and meaning social participation. So let's consider Australia first and the digital divide and what that picture looks like. So in terms of the overall picture, it is improving when we look at Australia as a whole for digital inclusion and ability in Australia. And since 2014, Australia's overall digital inclusion score, which through a report conducted by by Roy Morgan and the RMIT on behalf of the government, which was measuring Australia's digital divide, they were suggesting through their findings that the digital inclusion score has improved from 54 to 60.2 since 2014, with a 2-point increase in the last year. But the story is not rosy for all groups in Australia. Overall, there is significantly less digital inclusion for those particularly with low levels of education, employment and income. And further risks are those who live in rural or remote areas, those who are older Australians, particularly over the age of 65, the disabled and also Indigenous Australians. So if we compare, as we were just saying, Indigenous Australians particularly fall into this category of the digitally disadvantaged. And back in 2005, Samaras found that at that stage that they were digitally disadvantaged, but they were also overrepresented in the other factors of low income, unemployed, and low education. And since then, it hasn't improved a great deal. A little bit, but not by any great margin. So Indigenous Australians overall are 5.8 points below the national average for digital inclusion and digital ability. And this also needs, the digital inclusion, so the access point of view, but also the digital ability also needs urgent attention, according to the report. A further report by the Melbourne Network Society Institute in 2016 claimed that poor internet access, particularly for Indigenous Australians living in rural and remote areas, has brought continued educational and health inequities and has stopped the digital divide from narrowing. So a snapshot of looking at Indigenous, in terms of those key factors, the very fact of being Indigenous puts in that digital exclusion, but also, they have all those other social determinants where we see low scores for particularly those in primary school for the NAP plan, so in years 3, 5 and 7. Their scores are consistently lower than those of non-Indigenous students, which does not bode well from a beginning point of view. The gap between it's most markedly indicated in the higher education sector, and the biggest gap is in the bachelor degrees. The other indicators is that Indigenous Australians have a higher unemployment rate than non-Indigenous and also earn lower incomes. So it's like a compounding effect in terms of not only, they also, 1 in 5 Indigenous Australians live in remote and very remote areas. So they're really ticking the boxes in a lot of these factors of those who are digitally disadvantaged. And as we can see from the gap, and what I previously mentioned, is the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people aged 20 to 24 who have obtained a post-school qualification has not narrowed at all over time. It has in the TAFE sector, but in the degree it has not. So that's a pretty telling fact, and I guess begs the question as to what is occurring in terms of supporting Indigenous people seeking higher degrees, and those who are here, the support that they're actually. So I guess if we were looking at, and has it closed at all, the research suggests that it's narrowed, and the statistics suggest that it has narrowed, but it has deepened, and particularly for some, those Indigenous that live in remote regions. And that report I was talking about, conducted by Roy Morgan and RMIT, it actually didn't even, those figures were based on Indigenous Australians in regional, but it did not include the remote areas. So it would suggest that is something that really does need to be investigated further, and would probably put a much more drastic picture in terms of access for the Indigenous. And as the statistical snapshot shows, the Indigenous are still very much overrepresented in all of the risk factors for digital exclusion. So why has the gap not closed? Well, firstly, as seen by the statistics, there are still many social determinants that need to be addressed. Schneider suggests that the one-size-fits-all approach which government policy seems to be taking to improve digital inclusion and literacy for all Australians does not work if sustained changes is the goal. And there's this notion that there needs to be a move away from the terms such as close the gap and bridge the divide, which seems to be lip service or rhetoric, and a much deeper focus on social inclusion and engagement with the ability to use ICT by the Indigenous population as well as access. So what are some strategies that are being suggested to address the digital divide? And over the years there are lots of strategies that are being employed, and I think the better ones, as suggested by the list, are ones that include Indigenous educators and leaders in the process, as well as the Indigenous community, that use Indigenous culture to teach technology and inspire students about what technology can do and how they can use it so that it has meaning for them. Particularly in the rural and remote areas, there needs to be more programs and resources in the Indigenous communities, and community hubs and online access centres and libraries can play an important role in providing the access and education about ICTs. And likewise, educational institutions also need to do more, as well as governments, in terms of having policies and resources, but particularly in looking at primary education and opening up the access and education for information technology use for these, for the younger Indigenous Australians. So that's really, a good starting point. This TED Talk by Michael Meaney is, just to continue on from that idea of, getting into the communities, being genuine about, starting at the grassroots, including Indigenous and Aboriginal traditions in the programs. We're not going to watch the link to that. It's about 10 minutes, but you're welcome to have it. It's a very interesting listen. Some of the key messages that he brings through, which I think would go a long way to a lot of political policies being based around some of these messages. The first one, if you do not have a reasonable degree, this is according to Michael Meaney, if you do not have a reasonable degree of digital literacy by the age of 20, you are at a distinct disadvantage no matter which path you want to take. So he was, through the video, talks about, getting out into the community, running programs, getting them inspired and interested about what the technology can do for them. So his mantra was that students are not inspired by what technology is. They are inspired by about what it can do. So to wrap up in terms of the way forward and concluding this presentation, a couple of key points. So there needs to be a focus on social inclusion rather than a rhetoric to bridge the gap. There needs to be a move away from a one-size-fits-all approach by government and educational institutions, a genuine desire to improve the ICT awareness and ability for the Indigenous, particularly starting in primary education, and more funds to reach, engage and inspire Indigenous about digital technologies and their benefits. So in the words of Michael Meaney, I think it's pertinent to conclude with a quote that says, "So as Australians, we have a choice. We can continue down the path of digital divide, disadvantage and exclusion, which will only leave our students discouraged and disconnected, or together we can work towards removing these barriers and support our communities to prosper and grow. The choice is ours." Thank you very much for listening.